Let yourself sink deeper into the comfort of your bed tonight. Feel the weight of the day lifting from your shoulders as you adjust your pillow to just the right position. The room around you is quiet, peaceful, a sanctuary from the noise and demands of the modern world. Your breathing naturally begins to slow, each exhale releasing a little more tension, each inhale drawing in calm. Tonight, we're going on a journey together through time and across continents. We'll walk through a medieval village at dawn, feeling the cool morning air and hearing the first sounds of the day. We'll meet three extraordinary women whose lives changed the course of history in profound and lasting ways. But there's no rush, no urgency. We have all the time in the world, and as we move through these stories, you can let yourself drift, let the words wash over you like gentle waves. Your mind can wander, following these narratives or floating in that peaceful space between waking and dreams. Either way, you're exactly where you need to be. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Take one more deep breath, and let's begin our journey into the past. The darkness before dawn in medieval Europe was absolute in a way that's difficult for us to imagine now. There were no street lights filtering through windows, no glow from electronic devices, no distant hum of traffic or machinery. When you opened your eyes in a 13th century peasant's cottage, you were met with a blackness so complete it felt almost tangible, pressing against your face like soft fabric. But the body knew time even without clocks. Somewhere deep in your bones, an internal rhythm stirred you awake as the first hints of gray began to soften the eastern sky beyond the village. The air inside the cottage was thick and heavy, carrying the smell of wood smoke from last night's fire, now reduced to faint embers in the central hearth. Mixed with this was the earthy scent of packed dirt floors, the musty odor of straw bedding, and the warm animal smell of the family's few livestock who shared the dwelling during cold months for mutual warmth and protection. You shared a single room with your entire family. There were no separate bedrooms, no private spaces, no doors to close for solitude. Your husband lay beside you on the straw-stuffed mattress, his breathing still deep and steady. Your three children were curled together on another pallet near the wall, the youngest still small enough to nestle between her siblings. The family's two chickens roost in a corner, occasionally shifting and clucking softly in their sleep. A goat was tethered near the door, its presence a small comfort against the cold that seeped through the gaps in the wattle and daub walls. The cottage itself was tiny by any standard, perhaps 15 feet by 20 feet, with walls made of interwoven wooden strips packed with a mixture of mud, straw, and sometimes animal dung that dried to form a kind of plaster. The roof was thatched with rice straw or reeds, constantly needing repairs as rain and wind worked at the materials. There were no glass windows, just small openings that could be shuttered with wooden boards, though even these were often left open to let in what little light and air they could, despite the cold. Rising from bed meant leaving whatever warmth you had managed to create through the night with shared body heat and wool blankets that were rough, scratchy, and often alive with fleas and lice. These parasites were simply facts of life, so common that no one gave them much thought beyond the occasional scratch. Every person in the village carried them, from the poorest serf to the lord's family up at the manor house, though the wealthy could afford more frequent changes of linen and had servants to help with the constant battle against vermin. Your first task was to coax the fire back to life. This was crucial because starting a new fire was time-consuming and required precious resources. You kept the fire burning as continuously as possible, banking it carefully at night by covering the embers with ash to preserve the heat until morning. You crouched before the hearth, your knees cracking in the cold, and carefully brushed aside the ash with a stick. Beneath it, a faint red glow rewarded your hope. You added small twigs and dried leaves, blowing gently, coaxing the ember to catch. Smoke stung your eyes and caught in your throat, that familiar morning sensation that made you cough. As the fire began to grow, you added larger pieces of wood, precious fuel that had to be carefully managed. In some villages, the lord controlled access to the forests, and gathering firewood required paying fees or securing permissions. Every stick mattered. The growing light from the flames pushed back the darkness just a little, casting dancing shadows on the walls and illuminating your workspace as you began to prepare for the day. The floor beneath your feet was simply packed earth, hard and uneven, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that was changed infrequently. In winter, the floor was cold enough to hurt your bare feet, and in summer it was dusty and attracted insects. Furniture was minimal and crude. A rough wooden table, a few stools or benches, perhaps a chest for storing your few possessions. Most of your clothes you wore were kept in a basket. You owned perhaps 2 sets of garments, one for daily wear and one for special occasions like market days or religious festivals. As the fire strengthened, you filled a pot with water from the bucket near the door. This water had been drawn the evening before from the village well, a communal gathering place where news and gossip were exchanged. The bucket itself was made of wood bound with iron hoops, heavy when full, and you had carried it balanced on your head or suspended from a yoke across your shoulders. In summer, this was merely tedious work. In winter, when ice had to be broken on the well and your fingers went numb from the cold water, it became a test of endurance. The water went on the fire to heat. While it warmed, you roused the children gently, pulling the thin blankets from their sleeping forms. The youngest whimpered at the cold, and you pulled her close for a moment, sharing your warmth. Your daughter, perhaps 8 years old, was old enough now to have responsibilities, and she stumbled sleepily to help with the morning tasks. Your sons, 10 and 12, would soon join your husband in the fields for another day of endless labor. Your husband stirred, groaning as he sat up. His body ached constantly from the brutal physical work that defined his existence. His hands were calloused and scarred, his back often in pain, his joints swelling with the dampness that pervaded the cottage in every season but high summer. He was only 35 years old, but he moved like a much older man, worn down by years of toil that began when he was barely old enough to walk. There was no privacy for washing or dressing. Everyone changed clothes in the same room, though there was an understanding of turning away, of giving what small dignity could be afforded in such cramped quarters. Contrary to popular myth, medieval people did try to keep clean, though their standards and capabilities were vastly different from ours. You would wash your face and hands in the warmed water, and on market days or before religious services, you might even wash more thoroughly. But true bathing, immersing your whole body in water, was a rare luxury, perhaps happening only a few times a year. Clothes were simple, functional, and worn until they literally fell apart. For women, this meant a long linen shift worn directly against the skin, covered by a wool dress or kirtle that reached to the ankles. Over this went an apron to protect the dress during work. On your head, a simple linen coif or wimple covered your hair, which was almost never worn loose by a married woman. For men, it was a linen shirt and woolen hose that covered the legs, secured with leather laces, and a tunic that reached to the knees. In cold weather, everyone layered additional garments and wrapped themselves in cloaks or shawls. These clothes were never pure white or brightly colored, despite what some period illustrations might suggest. They were off-white at best, quickly becoming gray and stained with dirt, smoke, and food. Bright colors required expensive dyes and were the province of the wealthy. Your clothes were natural wool colors: brown, gray, off-white, perhaps a dull yellowish tone if they had been treated with urine, which served as both a cleaning agent and a fixative for what few dyes were available. As dawn properly broke, the first light creeping through the small window opening and the gaps in the door, the village began to come alive. You could hear your neighbors stirring, the sound of other doors opening, voices calling out morning greetings. A rooster crowed, announcing the new day with the same authority it had claimed yesterday and would claim again tomorrow. Dogs barked. Somewhere, a baby cried, the sound carrying clearly through the thin walls. The concept of breakfast as we know it didn't really exist for medieval peasants. The first meal of the day was simple, quick, and taken only after initial chores were completed. Food was the primary concern of every waking moment, a constant worry that shaped every decision and colored every day with varying shades of anxiety depending on the season and the success of the last harvest. Your family was fortunate in a relative sense. You were not starving. Your husband held a small plot of land, about 30 acres that you were allowed to farm in strips scattered across the village's fields. In exchange, you owed the Lord labor, typically 3 days a week of work on his personal lands, plus additional service during planting and harvest seasons. You also owed a portion of your crop as rent, and the church demanded its tithe, 10% of everything you produced. What this meant in practical terms was that roughly half of everything your family grew went to others. The margin between subsistence and starvation was razor thin, and a bad harvest could mean death. Even in good years, the last months before the new harvest came in were times of genuine hunger, when food stores dwindled and every meal became smaller, when you went to bed with your stomach cramping with emptiness. This particular morning, you had coarse bread from yesterday's baking. Bread was the foundation of the medieval diet, but not the soft, fluffy white bread we think of today. This was dense, heavy, made from a mixture of grains because wheat was too valuable to use on its own. Your bread was a mixture of rye and barley, perhaps with some peas or beans ground into the flour to extend it further. It was dark, gritty with bits of stone from the grinding process, and would quickly grow stale and hard. You tore pieces of this bread and distributed them to your family. To soften it, you dipped it in what remained of last night's pottage, a thick vegetable stew that was the other staple of your diet. This pottage had been simmering over the fire for days, continually added to with whatever was available. Cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips, beans, perhaps a few herbs from the small garden behind your cottage. Meat was a rarity, appearing in your pot only a few times a year, perhaps during harvest celebrations or major feast days. The taste was bland, sometimes unpleasantly so. Salt was expensive, another commodity controlled and taxed. Spices were completely out of reach, luxuries for the wealthy that you might have heard about but never tasted. Your food was seasoned with whatever wild herbs you could gather. Garlic, which grew in abundance, various wild greens, perhaps some dried mushrooms gathered from the woods in autumn. But this bread and pottage, humble as they were, represented security. They meant your family would not go hungry today. Your youngest child ate with her fingers, sopping the bread in the stew, her face intent and serious. Children learned early that food was not to be wasted, that every crumb mattered. After eating, there was ale, because water from the well, while used for cooking and washing, was often unsafe to drink directly. Ale provided both hydration and calories, and every household brewed it in small batches. This was usually the work of women, one of the many tasks that filled your days. The ale was weak by modern standards, more like a thin, slightly alcoholic grain drink than what we would recognize as beer, but it was safer than water and provided some nutrition. As your family finished eating, your husband and sons prepared for the fields. The day's work depended on the season, and the agricultural calendar dictated everything. Spring meant plowing and planting, backbreaking work that required following a team of oxen back and forth across the strips of land allocated to your family. Summer was weeding, tending crops, repairing fences, shearing sheep. Autumn meant the desperate race of harvest, when every able-bodied person worked from dawn until dusk to bring in the grain before weather could destroy it. Winter offered slightly less outdoor work but brought its own challenges of cold and hunger. This morning in late spring, they would be weeding the barley fields, a task that seemed endless. Weeds competed with crops for nutrients and space, and controlling them meant hours spent bent over, pulling plants by hand, moving slowly down the long strips. Your husband kissed you briefly, a gesture more of habit than affection, and left with your sons, each carrying simple tools, hoes made by the village blacksmith, worn smooth by countless hands. You were left with your daughter and the tasks that defined women's work in the medieval world. These tasks were no less demanding or important than the field work, though they were often undervalued and invisible in historical records. You would spend this day, like most days, in a constant round of labor that rarely paused from dawn until you collapsed into bed after dark. The morning stretched ahead with a list of tasks that seemed to grow even as you worked. Your daughter helped you carry water from the well, the two of you making multiple trips, the wooden yoke cutting into your shoulders as you balanced the filled buckets. At the well, you encountered other women from the village, and conversation flowed as easily as the water. This was how news traveled, how grievances were aired, how the invisible network of village life was maintained. Old Margaret was complaining about her aching joints, demonstrating how her fingers no longer straightened properly. Young Agnes, newly married, blushed as she confided that she thought she might be pregnant, touching her belly with a mixture of hope and fear. Pregnancy was dangerous, even deadly, and everyone knew women who had died in childbirth. It was so common that most women accepted it as a possibility they simply had to live with, hoping for luck and the intervention of saints. You shared what little news you had heard, that the Lord Steward had been seen surveying the common lands, which caused worry. There was always tension over access to common resources. The woods where you gathered firewood and foraged, the streams where you fished, the meadows where the village animals grazed. The Lord had the power to restrict this access, to impose new fees, to claim more for himself. And his decisions could mean the difference between survival and starvation for families operating on such thin margins. Back at your cottage, you set to work on bread making, because the process took all day and bread was eaten at every meal. This began with grinding grain, a task so labor-intensive that it made your arms burn and your back ache. You had a hand-operated corn, two circular stones that you turned against each other, feeding grain between them. It took hours to grind enough flour for a day's bread, and the flour was never fine, always containing bits of stone that wore down everyone's teeth. Archaeologists studying medieval skeletons can immediately identify peasants by their teeth. Worn down, often abscessed, causing constant pain. By the time you reached middle age, many of your teeth would be gone, making eating difficult and painful, further compromising your ability to get nutrition from your already inadequate diet. While the grain was grinding, you monitored the garden behind your cottage. This small plot was intensively cultivated, providing herbs, vegetables, and a few fruits that supplemented your diet. You grew onions, leeks, garlic, cabbage, peas, beans. If you were lucky, you had a few fruit trees, apple, pear, perhaps a plum. Every bit of space was used because these foods could mean the difference between merely surviving and having some small variation in your meals. You checked the chickens, collecting eggs when you found them. Eggs were valuable protein in a diet that had precious little, and they could be traded or sold. But often they were kept to raise more chickens because chickens themselves were valuable. A laying hen was an asset, providing eggs and eventually meat, though you would only slaughter one when absolutely necessary. The goat needed milking, another daily task. You crouched beside the animal, your head pressed against its warm flank, your hands working rhythmically to draw out the milk. The goat was contentious, sometimes kicking, but it was your only source of milk, which you made into cheese because fresh milk spoiled quickly. The cheese was simple, just pressed curds with salt, but it would keep for weeks and provided crucial nutrition, especially for the children. Your daughter helped where she could, learning the skills she would need when she had her own household. She was watching you constantly, absorbing the 1,000 small techniques and pieces of knowledge that were never written down but passed from mother to daughter. How to tell when bread dough was ready, how to judge the heat of the fire, how to select the best plants for gathering, how to stretch inadequate food to feed a family, how to manage the endless work with a body that was always tired. By mid-morning, you were sweating despite the cool air. You had already been working for hours, your body in constant motion. You paused for a moment, straightening your back with a grimace, and wiped your face with the corner of your apron. Your hands were rough and chapped, your fingernails broken and dirty. Your body was thinner than you would have liked, without the reserves of fat that might cushion you through lean times. Medieval peasants were generally shorter than modern people, a result of chronic malnutrition during childhood. As a woman, you stood perhaps 5 feet tall at most. Your husband was only a few inches taller. Stunted growth, frequent illness, parasite infections that robbed your body of nutrients, these were all part of the reality of medieval life. And yet, you endured because what choice did you have? As the sun reached its height, you could feel the day warming, though never to what we would consider comfortable. The medieval world was experiencing what historians call the medieval warm period, when temperatures in Europe were slightly higher than they would be in the coming centuries, but life for peasants remained harsh regardless of climate. Your husband and sons returned briefly from the fields for a midday meal, another simple affair of bread, cheese, and onions washed down with ale. They were already exhausted, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat, their hands blistered. Your older son had a cut on his arm from a sharp rock in the field, and you cleaned it with water and a cloth, knowing that such injuries could fester and become dangerous. There was no medicine as we understand it, just folk remedies, poultices of herbs, prayers to saints, hope. Your husband ate quickly, saying little. He was worried about the weeding, about getting it done before the Lord's steward called for labor on the manor lands. He owed the Lord 3 days of work each week, but during busy seasons like planting and harvest, this could increase to 6 days, leaving only Sundays, when work was forbidden by church law, to tend his own fields. Fall behind and your crops would fail. Fail to meet your obligations to the Lord, and you could lose your land tenure, be forced to pay crushing fines, or face physical punishment. The feudal system was a complicated web of obligations and dependencies that bound everyone in place. At the top was the king, though he seemed as remote as the stars. Below him were the great nobles, the dukes and earls who controlled vast territories. Below them were lesser nobles, knights who held land from their lords in exchange for military service. And at the bottom were peasants like your family, tied to the land and to the lord who controlled it. You were not slaves, though the distinction sometimes felt academic. You could not be sold separately from the land, but neither could you leave without permission. Your children were bound to the same conditions. Your labor, your time, the fruits of your work, all belonged in large part to others. You were what was known as a villain, tied to your lord's estate, required to work his land before your own, required to use his mill to grind your grain and pay him for the privilege, required to use his oven to bake your bread, with another fee attached. These fees were called banalites, and they were one of the many ways that peasants were systematically kept in poverty. The Lord monopolized essential services and charged for them. You couldn't take your grain elsewhere or build your own mill. Try to do so, and the punishment would be severe. Fines you couldn't pay, the confiscation of property, physical punishment, imprisonment. After your husband and sons returned to the fields, you turned to your own afternoon work. There was always spinning and weaving to be done, the never-ending task of producing cloth for your family's clothing. Wool had to be cleaned, carded to align the fibers, spun into thread, and woven into fabric. This was entirely done by hand with simple tools. A distaff to hold the raw wool, a drop spindle to spin it into thread, a simple loom to weave the thread into cloth. The entire process was enormously time-consuming. It could take weeks to produce enough cloth for a single garment, and your family needed constant replacements as clothes wore out. This work was portable, at least something you could do while watching the children, while tending the fire, while waiting for bread to rise. Your hands were never idle, always spinning, always producing thread that accumulated slowly, impossibly slowly. As you worked, you kept one eye on your youngest daughter, who played in the dirt near the cottage with small stones and sticks, creating imaginary worlds. She was barefoot, her feet tough from going without shoes except in the depths of winter. Her dress was a simplified version of yours, made from scraps and hand-me-downs, patched and repatched. Her hair was roughly cut, practical rather than pretty. She would start helping with real work within a year or two, her childhood brief and largely joyless by modern standards. The afternoon brought different tasks, no less demanding. He needed to tend the garden more thoroughly, weeding between the vegetables, checking for pests that could destroy your plants. Caterpillars were a constant problem, and you picked them off by hand, crushing them between your fingers. Slugs left silvery trails across cabbage leaves, and you gathered these too, feeding them to the chickens who ate them eagerly. Your back ached from all the bending, and you paused frequently, pressing your hands to your spine, trying to ease the constant pain. You were only 28 years old, but your body was already breaking down from endless work and multiple pregnancies. You had given birth 5 times, though only 3 children survived past infancy. The 2 you lost were buried in the churchyard, tiny graves that you visited whenever you could, whispering prayers for their souls. Infant mortality was staggeringly high in the medieval world. Perhaps 1 in 3 babies died before their first birthday, and half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, these claimed young lives with horrifying regularity. You knew every woman in the village who had lost children, which was to say you knew every woman in the village. Grief was a shared experience, a bond that connected mothers across the entire society. As you worked in the garden, your neighbor called over the low fence that separated your properties. She wanted to borrow your wooden bucket, hers having cracked beyond repair. You agreed readily because village life depended on these kinds of exchanges and mutual assistance. You borrowed from her, she borrowed from you, and in this way everyone survived. Refuse to participate in this web of reciprocity, and you would find yourself isolated, unable to function when you needed help. The church bell rang from the stone building at the center of the village, marking one of the canonical hours that divided the day. The church was the largest and most permanent structure in the village, built of stone when everything else was wood and mud. It dominated the landscape physically and symbolically, a constant reminder of the church's power and presence. You paused in your work, crossed yourself, and murmured a brief prayer. Religion permeated every aspect of medieval life, not just Sundays but every day, every activity. Saints were called upon for specific needs. Saint Christopher for travel, Saint Catherine for a good marriage, Saint Margaret for safe childbirth. You prayed to them regularly, asking for help, for protection, for the small miracles that made life bearable. Holy days and feast days broke up the year, providing rare moments of celebration and rest, though even these involved work in their own way. Special foods had to be prepared, the house cleaned, good clothes aired and mended. The church also demanded its due. The tithe was strictly enforced, 10% of everything you produced going to the parish priest. This included grain, eggs, wool, even the vegetables from your garden. The priest came regularly to collect, and his arrival was never welcome, though you dared not show displeasure. The church held power over not just your material life but your spiritual one, and the threat of excommunication, of being cut off from the sacraments in the hope of salvation, was a terrifying prospect. By late afternoon, you were preparing the evening meal, which would be similar to breakfast but perhaps with more substantial additions if you were fortunate. Today you added some dried fish to the pottage, a herring that had been salted and stored. Fish was one source of protein that was somewhat more accessible than meat, though still expensive and carefully rationed. The church forbade eating meat on Fridays and during Lent, but fish was allowed, which increased its importance and value. You chopped the fish into small pieces, added it to the pot with fresh water, more vegetables from the garden, a handful of dried beans. The smell as it cooked was rich and savory, and you felt your mouth water. The children would be happy tonight, their bellies fuller than usual. You stirred the pot, added more wood to the fire, and felt a moment of satisfaction. This was good, you were managing, your family would eat well tonight. As the sun began its descent, your husband and sons returned from the fields for the final time that day. They were beyond exhausted, moving with the slow, pained gait of men who had pushed their bodies past reasonable limits. Your husband's face was deeply tanned and weathered, lined beyond his years. Your older son was developing the same look, the permanent stamp of agricultural labor that marked peasants as clearly as any other identifying feature. They washed briefly at the bucket of water near the door, cleaning the worst of the dirt from their hands and faces. Then they came inside, grateful to be off their feet, to be done with work for the day. The cottage was warm from the fire, thick with the smell of cooking food and with smoke. It was crowded and close, but it was home, and there was comfort in that familiarity. You served the evening meal, ladling the pottage into wooden bowls. There were no plates, no individual portions as we would understand them. The family ate from common vessels, tearing bread to sop up the stew, using their fingers or rough wooden spoons. Table manners in the modern sense didn't exist. You ate quickly and efficiently, refueling your body for the next day's work. Conversation during the meal was limited, mostly your husband mentioning concerns about the crops or discussing when he would need to fulfill his next labor obligation at the manor. Your older son asked about the upcoming fair in the nearest market town, a rare treat that happened only a few times a year. These fairs were exciting breaks in routine, chances to see peddlers and performers, to buy goods not available in the village, to experience something beyond the narrow confines of everyday life. After eating, there were still tasks to complete before darkness made work impossible. The fire needed to be banked for the night, animals secured, the cottage made as tight as possible against the night air. Your husband checked the door, making sure the wooden bar would hold it closed. There was always a slight fear of thieves, though in truth, most people in the village had nothing worth stealing. More concerning were wild animals, wolves that sometimes came close to settlements, and foxes that raided chicken coops. As twilight deepened into night, the family gathered close to the fire. This was the only time of day when work truly paused, though your hands continued spinning while even as you sat. Your daughter sat beside you learning the motions. Your husband carved a new handle for a tool, his hands never quite still. Only the children were truly at rest, the youngest already falling asleep against your side. Sometimes there were stories, old tales passed down through generations, about heroes and monsters, magical creatures that lived in the deep forest, saints and their miracles. These stories were the entertainment, the shared culture of people who could not read and had no books even if they could. Your husband had a good memory for stories, and his voice in the firelight was soothing, creating images in the darkness that the children listened to with wide eyes. But tonight, everyone was too tired even for stories. One by one, family members rose and moved to their sleeping pallets, pulling worn blankets over themselves. You were among the last, making sure the fire was properly banked, checking once more on the children. Then you lay down beside your husband on the straw mattress, pulled the blanket up to your chin and closed your eyes. The cottage was dark now, the last glow of the fire barely visible through your eyelids. You could hear your family breathing around you, the familiar sounds of night. Wind in the thatch, a dog barking somewhere in the village, the distant hoot of an owl. Your body ached with tiredness, every muscle sore, your hands rough and painful. Tomorrow would bring the same endless round of work, the same struggles, the same fears about food and survival. And yet, sleep came quickly, as it always did when you worked yourself to exhaustion. Your mind, which had been sharp and busy all day, finally quieted. Your breathing slowed and deepened, matching your husband's beside you. And in that small, crude cottage, surrounded by your family, you found the rest that would allow you to face another day. Now let yourself drift forward through time, leaving behind the medieval village with all its hardships and struggles. We're moving ahead several centuries across plains and forests to the vast expanse of Russia in the 18th century. Here, in the glittering world of imperial courts and political intrigue, we meet one of history's most remarkable women, a German princess who would become one of Russia's greatest rulers. She was born Sophie Friedrich August von Anhalt-Zerbst on the 2nd in May in 1729, in the Prussian city of Stettin, which today we know as Szczecin in Poland. Her father, Christian August, was a minor German prince, the kind of small-scale nobility that populated the fragmented landscape of the Holy Roman Empire. Her mother, Princess Johanna Elizabeth of Holstein-Gottorp, was better connected than her husband, related to several important families, and she never let anyone forget it. Sophie's childhood was, by her own later admission, unremarkable. She would write in her memoirs that she saw nothing of interest in her early years, a statement that perhaps reflected how drastically her life would change rather than actual lack of incident. She was not born to great wealth or obvious power. Her family's palace, while respectable, was modest by royal standards. They struggled financially, living on the edge of what was acceptable for their rank, dependent on the goodwill and support of wealthier relatives. From her earliest years, Sophie was groomed for an advantageous marriage. because for minor princesses, marriage was the primary pathway to security and status. Her mother, Johanna, was particularly ambitious in this regard, constantly scheming and planning, taking Sophie with her on visits to better connected relatives, always looking for opportunities to advance her daughter's prospects. Sophie's education reflected these ambitions. She was taught French, which was the language of educated and sophisticated Europeans in the 18th century. She studied history, music, and religion, the last being particularly important. She was raised Lutheran, but this would prove to be merely a starting point in her religious journey. She also learned dance and deportment, how to move gracefully, how to conduct herself in society, all the skills that a princess would need to make a good impression. But beyond these formal lessons, Sophie was developing qualities that would serve her far better than musical accomplishments or perfect posture. She was intelligent, genuinely so, with a curiosity about the world and a capacity for learning that went beyond merely memorizing facts. She was observant, watching how people behaved, understanding the dynamics of power and influence even as a child. And she was determined, possessing a will that, once fixed on a goal, would not be easily deflected. When Sophie was 10 years old, she met an 11-year-old boy named Charles Peter Ulrich, the Duke of Holstein. He was the grandson of Peter the Great of Russia and the heir to both the Russian and Swedish thrones, an extraordinary position for a child. This meeting, arranged by ambitious relatives, was clearly intended to lay the groundwork for a future marriage alliance. Sophie later claimed that she found Peter agreeable and well-bred at this first meeting, though subsequent encounters would reveal a very different reality. The real turning point in Sophie's life came when she was 14 years old. The Russian Empress Elizabeth, who had no children of her own, had designated Peter as her heir and brought him to Russia. Now she was looking for a suitable bride for him, and Sophie's name was put forward by relatives who had influence at the Russian court. An invitation arrived for Sophie and her mother to travel to Russia to meet Peter again and to be considered as his potential bride. This invitation was everything Johanna had been working toward, the opportunity she had dreamed of. They departed in December of 1743, traveling in the depths of winter across vast distances, a journey that was both uncomfortable and exciting. Sophie arrived in Russia in February of 1744, and she entered a world that was completely different from anything she had known. The Russian court was magnificent, wealthy beyond the imagining of her modest German upbringing. The palaces were enormous, heated by massive stoves, decorated with incredible luxury. Servants were everywhere, attending to every need. Food was abundant and rich, presented on gold and silver plate. This was power made visible, wealth on a scale that took her breath away. And Sophie wanted it. Not just the luxury, though she certainly appreciated that after years of genteel poverty, but the power, the importance, the opportunity to be at the center of great events. She understood immediately that this was her chance, perhaps her only chance, to transcend the limitations of her birth and become someone significant. But there were obstacles. Peter, the young man she was supposed to marry, had changed dramatically since their childhood meeting. He was sickly, immature, and showed little interest in Russia or in becoming Russian. He remained obsessively attached to his German homeland and spent his time playing with toy soldiers, organizing elaborate military games, and drinking heavily. Their first encounters as potential spouses were awkward at best, and Sophie could see that this was not going to be a love match, not even a partnership of mutual respect. But Sophie was practical and strategic in ways that would define her entire life. She didn't need to love Peter. She needed to marry him to secure her position, and then to make the best of the situation. So she set about winning over the person who truly mattered, Empress Elizabeth. Elizabeth was a formidable woman in her own right, the daughter of Peter the Great, who had seized the throne through a coup. She was intelligent, cunning, and deeply Russian in her identity and loyalties. She would be watching Sophie carefully, evaluating whether this German princess could become truly Russian, could produce heirs, could be trusted. Sophie's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and its dedication. She threw herself into learning Russian, studying intensively with tutors, practicing constantly, pushing herself so hard that she would later write that she made herself ill from the effort. She would wake in the middle of the night and walk barefoot on the cold floors while reading Russian texts, trying to memorize vocabulary and grammar. This dedication nearly killed her when she caught pneumonia from the cold, but it also impressed Elizabeth tremendously. Here was a girl who was willing to suffer for Russia, who took her obligations seriously. Sophie also converted to Russian Orthodox Christianity, abandoning her Lutheran faith. This was not a casual decision. Religious conversion in the 18th century was a serious matter, representing a complete break with one's past community and identity. Her father was upset by this change, seeing it as a betrayal of their family's Lutheran heritage. But Sophie understood that to be Russian, to be truly accepted, she needed to embrace Orthodoxy fully. Her conversion ceremony took place in June of 1744. She took the Russian name Ekaterina Alexeyevna, which we know as Catherine. It was a rebirth, a deliberate transformation from Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst to Catherine of Russia. She was no longer a minor German princess. She was now Grand Duchess Catherine, betrothed to the heir of one of the most powerful empires in the world. The wedding to Peter took place in August of 1745, when Catherine was 16 years old. It was a magnificent ceremony, as befitted the marriage of the heir to the throne, with elaborate rituals, crowds of nobles, celebrations that lasted for days. But behind the splendor, the marriage itself was troubled from the start. Peter remained immature and uninterested in his bride. He preferred the company of his servants and military advisors, spending his time drilling soldiers in the Prussian style and drinking. He was infatuated with Frederick the Great of Prussia and everything Prussian, showing open contempt for Russia and Russian culture. This was dangerous, politically foolish, and increasingly worrying to Empress Elizabeth and her advisors. Catherine, meanwhile, was learning. She was always learning. She observed court politics, understanding the factions and rivalries. She read extensively, devouring books on history, philosophy, and politics. She was particularly drawn to the works of the French Enlightenment philosophers, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot. These thinkers were questioning traditional authority, proposing new ideas about government, justice, and human rights, and Catherine absorbed their ideas eagerly. The next 17 years of Catherine's life were a period of profound uncertainty mixed with careful preparation. Her position at court was secure enough because she was married to the heir, but it was also deeply vulnerable. Peter was clearly unsuited to rule, and his behavior became more erratic and concerning as he aged. Catherine had to navigate between maintaining her position, not alienating Elizabeth, and preparing for the moment when Peter would become emperor. One major source of pressure was the need to produce an heir. Elizabeth was desperate for Catherine to have children to ensure the succession. But Peter and Catherine's marital relations were problematic. Peter showed little interest in his wife, and there were whispers at the court that the marriage remained unconsummated for years. Whether this was due to Peter's immaturity, possible medical issues, or simply lack of desire, it created enormous stress for Catherine. The situation was resolved, according to most historians, with the tacit approval of Empress Elizabeth. Catherine took lovers discreetly at first, and in September of 1754 she gave birth to a son, Paul. The child was immediately taken from her by Elizabeth, who raised him herself, barely allowing Catherine to see him. This was deeply painful for Catherine, but it also secured her position. She had produced an heir, fulfilling her primary duty. The question of Paul's paternity has been debated by historians for centuries. Officially, he was Peter's son, but many believe his biological father was Sergei Saltykov, a Russian nobleman and one of Catherine's lovers. Catherine herself was deliberately vague on this point in her memoirs, never explicitly confirming or denying the speculation. What mattered at the time was that the empire had an heir, and Catherine had proven her value. During these years, Catherine cultivated relationships carefully. She befriended important nobles, particularly the powerful Orlov brothers, who were officers in the Imperial Guard. She maintained correspondence with leading intellectuals, including Voltaire, establishing herself as a patron of arts and learning. She was building a network of support, slowly and patiently, preparing for an uncertain future. Her reading during this period was extensive and serious. She studied Russian history and law, understanding the traditions and structures of the empire she hoped to influence. She read about other countries and their systems of government. She thought deeply about how Russia could be reformed, modernized, made more efficient and just. She was preparing herself to rule, even though there was no clear path by which that would happen. Peter, meanwhile, was doing the opposite. He alienated almost everyone at court with his erratic behavior and his open admiration for Prussia. He mocked Russian traditions, offended the Orthodox Church, and showed contempt for the military. He made it clear that he intended to reverse many of Russia's policies when he became emperor, particularly regarding foreign affairs, where he wanted to ally with Prussia against Russia's current allies. Empress Elizabeth died in December of 1761, and Peter became Emperor Peter III. His reign would last exactly 6 months, one of the shortest in Russian history, and it would be a disaster. Peter immediately began implementing policies that outraged Russian sensibilities. He made peace with Prussia on terms that seemed to give away Russian gains. He instituted reforms of the Orthodox Church that seemed designed to undermine its power and prestige. He ordered Russian troops to prepare for war against Denmark to recover his ancestral lands in Holstein, a war that made no sense from a Russian perspective. Most dangerously for Peter, he antagonized the military, particularly the elite guards regiments. He wanted to reorganize them along Prussian lines, which the Russian officers saw as an insult to their traditions and competence. He paraded around in Prussian uniforms, making no secret of his preference for everything German over everything Russian. Catherine, during these 6 months, watched and waited. She remained quiet, attending church regularly, being seen as pious and properly Russian. She made no moves against her husband, but she also did nothing to support him. When nobles and officers came to her privately, expressing their concerns about Peter's policies, she listened sympathetically but committed to nothing explicit. She was giving Peter enough rope to hang himself while ensuring that when the moment came, she would be seen as the alternative. The crisis came in late June of 1762. Peter had left St. Petersburg for a suburban palace, planning to travel from there to lead his army against Denmark. Catherine was at another palace, Peterhof, preparing to join him. The Guards regiments in St. Petersburg were restless, angry at Peter's reforms and his obvious contempt for them. Several officers, including Gregory and Alexei Orlov, who were Catherine's supporters and in Gregory's case her lover, were organizing opposition. On the morning of June 28th, Alexei Orlov arrived at Peterhof in a carriage and woke Catherine with urgent news. The plot was moving forward, perhaps ahead of schedule. It was time to act. Catherine dressed quickly in simple clothing and rode back to St. Petersburg with Orlov. This was the moment of supreme risk. If the coup failed, she would be arrested, probably executed. Everything she had worked for over 18 years would be destroyed. But when she arrived at the barracks of the Ismailovsky Guards, the soldiers greeted her with enthusiasm. They swore allegiance to her as their empress, not to Peter. Other regiments followed suit. By the end of the day, all of the St. Petersburg garrison had declared for Catherine. The church hierarchy blessed her claim. The Senate, the body of high nobles who advised the emperor, recognized her as sovereign. It was a remarkably bloodless and efficient coup. Peter, when he heard what had happened, was at first disbelieving, then panicked. He tried to negotiate, offering to share power with Catherine. She refused. He tried to flee to his naval fortress at Kronstadt, but the navy had already declared for Catherine. Finally, realizing he had no support anywhere, Peter signed documents of abdication. Catherine was now Empress Catherine II, autocrat of all Russia. She was 33 years old. She had taken power in a coup against her husband, which meant her claim to the throne was technically illegitimate. She had no direct hereditary right to rule. Her son Paul, now 8 years old, had a better claim, and there were certainly nobles who thought the throne should go to him, with Catherine as regent. But Catherine had no intention of being a regent or a temporary ruler. She intended to rule in her own name, and she moved quickly to consolidate power. Peter was placed under guard at a small estate called Rapsha, ostensibly to keep him safe but really as a prisoner. 8 days after his abdication, Peter was dead, officially from a hemorrhoid-related illness, but almost certainly murdered by his guards, possibly with Catherine's knowledge or even orders. Catherine never explicitly admitted ordering Peter's death, but she also never denied it or punished those responsible. Peter's death, convenient as it was, remained a shadow over her reign, something her enemies would always use to question her legitimacy. But for Catherine, the immediate concern was maintaining her grip on power and showing Russia and the world that she could rule effectively. The first years of Catherine's reign were consumed with establishing her authority and implementing reforms. She was acutely aware that she was a foreign-born woman ruling an empire that had no tradition of female rulers holding power independently, despite her immediate predecessors Elizabeth and Anna. She needed to prove herself capable, strong, and beneficial to Russia. One of her first major initiatives was the creation of a legislative commission, convened in 1767. This was an attempt to create a new legal code for Russia, something that had been needed for decades. Catherine wrote a lengthy document called the Nakaz, or Instruction, which outlined her philosophy of government, drawing heavily on Enlightenment ideas about justice, the rule of law, and rational governance. The Nakaz was radical in many of its propositions, at least on paper. Catherine argued against torture, suggesting that it was both cruel and ineffective at determining truth. She proposed that the law should apply equally to all people, though in practice she maintained the rigid class distinctions of Russian society. She wrote about the importance of education and the need to improve the conditions of ordinary people. These ideas put her in correspondence and sometimes in contact with the leading thinkers of Europe. Voltaire called her the Star of the North and praised her as an enlightened ruler bringing progress to Russia. But the reality was more complicated than the rhetoric. The Legislative Commission met for over a year with representatives from different classes and regions of Russia, but it ultimately failed to produce a new legal code. The discussions revealed deep divisions in Russian society, particularly around the question of serfdom. Russia's economy was built on the labor of serfs, peasants who were bound to the land and to the nobles who owned that land. They could be bought and sold, punished at their owner's discretion, and had essentially no legal rights. Catherine personally opposed serfdom, or at least she said she did in her private writings and correspondence. She recognized it as unjust and economically inefficient. But she also recognized that the nobility on whose support her power rested would never accept its abolition. So instead of challenging serfdom, her reign actually saw it expand and intensify. More people were enserfed, and the powers of nobles over their serfs increased. This contradiction between Catherine's enlightened rhetoric and her actual policies would characterize much of her reign. In 1773, a massive peasant uprising erupted in southern Russia, led by a Cossack named Yemilian Pugachev. Pugachev claimed to be Peter III, miraculously survived and returned to free the peasants from oppression. This was clearly false, but desperate people wanted to believe it. The rebellion spread rapidly, engulfing huge territories, with serfs murdering their noble masters and burning estates. Catherine was genuinely frightened by this uprising. It revealed the depth of peasant resentment and the fragility of the social order. She responded with military force, sending armies to crush the rebellion. Pugachev was eventually captured, brought to Moscow in a cage, and executed in a particularly brutal fashion. Catherine then instituted harsh measures to prevent future rebellions, increasing surveillance and control over the peasant population. The Pugachev rebellion marked a turning point in Catherine's reign. Her early idealism, her belief that Russia could be reformed through enlightened policies, gave way to a more conservative approach focused on maintaining order and supporting the nobility. She remained a patron of arts and learning. She continued to correspond with philosophers, but her domestic policies became increasingly focused on preserving the status quo rather than transforming it. Where Catherine truly excelled and made her greatest mark on history was in foreign policy and military affairs. She had a clear strategic vision for Russia: expansion to the south and west, gaining access to warm water ports, establishing Russia as a dominant European power. She pursued these goals relentlessly and successfully over her 34-year reign. Her most significant achievements came in wars against the Ottoman Empire. Russia and the Ottoman Empire were natural rivals, competing for control of the Black Sea region and the lands around it. Catherine fought two major wars against the Ottomans, in 1768 through 74 and again in 1787 through 92. Both wars resulted in significant Russian victories and territorial gains. The First War was particularly important. Russian forces, led by talented commanders like Pyotr Rumyantsev, defeated Ottoman armies in major battles. The Russian navy, which Catherine had worked to strengthen, won a stunning victory at Kesma Bay, destroying the Ottoman fleet. When peace was finally negotiated, Russia gained control of the northern Black Sea coast, a huge strategic victory that gave Russia the warm water access Catherine wanted. Catherine was personally involved in military planning and strategic decisions, unusual for a female ruler at that time. She corresponded regularly with her commanders, discussed strategy, and made final decisions on major campaigns. She was not on the battlefield herself, obviously, but she was far from a passive observer. She understood military power as essential to political power, and she used it effectively. The Second Ottoman War was equally successful, further expanding Russian territory and influence. By the end of Catherine's reign, Russia had established itself firmly as a Black Sea power, had founded major cities like Odessa, and had made significant inroads into the Caucasus region. But Catherine's foreign policy wasn't limited to wars with the Ottomans. She also participated in the partitions of Poland, which eliminated Poland as an independent state and divided its territory among Russia, Prussia, and Austria. There were three partitions in 1772, 1793, and 1795. By the final partition, Poland had ceased to exist, and Russia had gained significant territory with a large population. The destruction of Poland was one of the most controversial aspects of Catherine's foreign policy. From a purely practical power politics perspective, it was logical. Poland was weak, divided by internal conflicts and surrounded by stronger neighbors. Allowing it to be absorbed meant gaining territory and eliminating a potential threat. But it also meant destroying an ancient kingdom and subjugating millions of people who did not want to be part of the Russian Empire. Catherine justified these expansions in various ways. She spoke of reuniting ancient Russian lands, of spreading civilization to backward regions, of Russia's historical destiny to rule over these territories. These justifications satisfied some, but others saw a naked imperial aggression, the strong preying on the weak because they could. Despite the military focus of much of her reign, Catherine is also remembered as a great patron of arts, culture, and learning. She saw herself as an enlightened ruler, and she wanted Russia to be seen as a cultured, sophisticated nation on par with France, Britain, or Austria. She founded the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, beginning with the purchase of large art collections from Western Europe. She bought entire libraries, thousands of paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects. The Hermitage would grow to become one of the world's greatest art museums, a project that Catherine began and that reflected her vision of Russia as a center of culture. She encouraged architecture and urban development, commissioning beautiful buildings in St. Petersburg and other cities. The Russian capital was transformed during her reign, becoming a truly impressive city of palaces, churches, and public buildings that could rival any European capital. Architects worked in various styles, from Baroque to neoclassical, creating an architectural legacy that still defines St. Petersburg today. Catherine was herself a writer, producing plays, essays, and most famously her memoirs. She corresponded with hundreds of people, from monarchs to philosophers to scientists. Her letters show a woman of genuine intelligence and curiosity, interested in everything from political philosophy to new agricultural techniques, from literature to military strategy. She also reformed education, founding schools including the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, one of the first state-supported schools for girls in Europe. She believed in education as a tool for improving society, though in practice, these educational reforms reached only a small portion of the population, primarily the nobility and wealthy merchants. She invited artists, musicians, and writers to her court, making St. Petersburg a cultural center. She corresponded with Voltaire for years, with Diderot, with many other leading thinkers. She positioned herself as their patron and Russia as a place where enlightened ideas could flourish. Whether this was genuine belief or clever propaganda is debatable, probably a mixture of both. Catherine's personal life was complex and often scandalous by the standards of her time. She had numerous lovers throughout her life, particularly in the years after she came to power. This was unusual behavior for a female ruler, and it generated enormous gossip both at court and across Europe. Her most famous lover was Gregory Potemkin, a brilliant and ambitious military commander and statesman. Their relationship began in 1774 and was intense, passionate, and politically significant. Potemkin became one of Catherine's most important advisors, leading military campaigns, governing newly acquired territories, and shaping policy. Some historians believe they actually married in secret, though this has never been definitively proven. Even after their romantic relationship evolved into friendship, Potemkin remained central to Catherine's court and policies until his death in 1791. He was the love of her life in a way that none of her other favorites were, and she mourned him deeply when he died. But there were many others. Stanislaw Poniatowski, whom Catherine later helped become King of Poland. Alexei Orlov, one of the brothers who helped her seize power. Platon Zubov, her last favorite, who was 40 years younger than Catherine and whom she took as a lover when she was in her 60s. Each of these men received wealth, titles, and positions of power from Catherine, which led to accusations that she was ruled by her favorites, that they were manipulating her. This criticism was unfair and gendered. Male monarchs had mistresses throughout history, lavishing gifts and honors on them without facing the same level of condemnation. Catherine's lovers were visible at court and politically influential, yes, but Catherine herself always remained firmly in control. She might have been influenced by their advice, but final decisions were hers. When favorites fell out of favor or became inconvenient, she dismissed them, albeit usually generously, and moved on. Catherine never remarried after Peter's death. This was a deliberate choice. As a married woman, she would have been legally subordinate to her husband under the laws of the time. As a widow and empress, she was fully autonomous, answerable to no one. She was not going to give up that independence for any man, no matter how much she might love him. By the time Catherine reached her 60s, she had been ruling Russia for over 30 years. She had transformed the country, expanding its borders dramatically, establishing it as one of Europe's great powers, reforming its administration, and bringing culture and sophistication to its court. But she had also presided over the intensification of serfdom, crushed rebellion brutally, and participated in the destruction of Poland. Her relationship with her son Paul had always been strained. She had been forced to give him up as a baby to Elizabeth, and they never formed a close bond. As Paul grew older, the relationship deteriorated further. Paul was critical of his mother's policies and her personal life. Catherine, in turn, viewed her son as unstable and unsuited to rule. She considered bypassing him in favor of her grandson Alexander, but ultimately never made this official. In the 1790s, Catherine's health began to decline. She had always been robust and energetic, But age was catching up with her. She remained mentally sharp, still working on government business, still writing, still making plans. But physically she was slowing down. On November 5th, 1796, Catherine suffered a stroke while in her private rooms. She collapsed and never regained consciousness. She died the following day, November 6th, at the age of 67. She had ruled Russia for 34 years, longer than almost any other Russian monarch. Her son Paul succeeded her, immediately working to reverse many of her policies and rehabilitate his father Peter III's memory. But Paul's reign would be brief and troubled, ending with his assassination in 1801. It was Catherine's grandson Alexander who would become a significant ruler, fighting Napoleon and continuing some of Catherine's policies of expansion and reform. Catherine's legacy is complex and contested. She was undeniably one of the most effective rulers Russia ever had, expanding its territory dramatically, establishing it as a major European power, and bringing culture and sophistication to the court. But she also presided over increased oppression of the peasantry, participated in imperial aggression against neighboring states, and ruled autocratically, never allowing any genuine sharing of power. For women's history specifically, Catherine represents a fascinating case study. She proved that a woman could rule a major empire successfully, making military and political decisions, managing complex diplomacy, and maintaining power for decades. She did this in a society that had no tradition of female rule and that viewed women as naturally inferior to men in matters of politics and warfare. She had to be twice as competent as any man to be taken half as seriously, and yet she succeeded spectacularly. But she also did nothing to improve the position of ordinary women in Russia. Serfdom affected women as brutally as men, perhaps more so given their vulnerability to sexual exploitation by nobles. Catherine's reforms in education benefited only elite women, a tiny fraction of the female population. She herself lived a life of extraordinary privilege and power that was completely inaccessible to virtually every other woman in her empire. Catherine the Great died at the age of 67, having ruled for over 3 decades. She had transformed herself from Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess with few prospects, into Catherine II, Empress of all Russia, one of the most powerful people in the world. It was an extraordinary achievement, a testament to her intelligence, determination, and political skill. Let's drift now across an ocean and back through time, to a world of pyramids rising above jungle canopy, to the ancient Maya civilization at its height. In the 7th century, deep in what is now the Mexican state of Chiapas, the city of Palenque flourished. And within that city lived a woman whose power and status would remain hidden for over 1,300 years, until archaeologists uncovered her tomb in 1994. The archaeologists Arnaldo Gonzalez Cruz and Fanny Lopez Hernandez were conducting routine stabilization work on Temple 13, a stepped pyramid structure adjacent to Palenque's famous Temple of the Inscriptions. The Temple of the Inscriptions housed the tomb of King Kinich Janab Pakal, known to history as Pakal the Great, one of the most famous Maya rulers. His tomb, discovered in 1952 by Alberto Rusluilier, had been a sensation, the first time archaeologists had found a sarcophagus burial inside a Maya pyramid. Temple 13 was smaller than the Temple of the Inscriptions, standing perhaps 12 meters high, built in the distinctive Palenque style with steep stairs leading to a temple structure at the summit. Inside, passages and chambers had collapsed and been blocked by debris over the centuries. As Gonzalez Cruz and Lopez Hernandez worked to stabilize the structure, they discovered passages that led deeper into the pyramid's interior. What they found took their breath away. A burial chamber intact, sealed for over 1,000 years. Inside was a limestone sarcophagus, and when they opened it, everything inside was stained a brilliant, vivid red. The skeletal remains, the burial offerings, the ornaments, everything was covered in cinnabar, a bright red powder made from mercury sulfide that the Maya considered sacred and life-giving. This was how she got her name, the Red Queen. Her true identity was unknown because, Unlike Peko's tomb with its extensive hieroglyphic inscriptions, her burial contained no written identification. Archaeologists were faced with a mystery: an obviously high-status woman, buried with incredible wealth and ceremony in a location that suggested she was deeply important to Peko, but no clear indication of exactly who she was. To understand the Red Queen, we need to understand the world she inhabited. The Maya civilization reached its classic period peak between roughly 250 and 900 AD, developing one of the most sophisticated cultures in the pre-Columbian Americas. They built magnificent cities of stone, created a complex writing system, developed advanced mathematics including the concept of zero, and tracked astronomical cycles with remarkable precision. Palenque, known to its inhabitants as La Cama or Place of Great Waters, was situated in the foothills of the Chiapas Mountains where several rivers converged, creating waterfalls and pools. The location was both beautiful and strategic, providing water, defensible terrain, and access to trade routes. The city proper covered about a square mile, though its influence extended far beyond its physical boundaries. The architecture of Palenque is considered among the finest Maya construction, characterized by elegant proportions, extensive use of interior spaces, and elaborate decoration. The palace complex, with its distinctive four-story tower, featured courtyards, galleries, and intricate stucco sculptures. The temples, built on pyramid platforms, contained elaborate tomb chambers and were decorated with hieroglyphic texts that told the history of the ruling dynasty. This was not a primitive society. The Maya had a sophisticated understanding of agriculture, managing the challenging tropical environment through techniques including raised fields, terracing, and complex water management systems. They traded extensively, creating networks that connected distant regions and brought exotic goods like jade from Guatemala, obsidian from the highlands, and marine shells from both coasts. But Maya society was also intensely hierarchical and frequently violent. City-states competed for dominance, engaging in warfare that combined ritual elements with practical goals of capturing enemies for sacrifice, extracting tribute, and establishing political supremacy. Kings and queens were not just political leaders but sacred figures, intermediaries between the human and divine worlds, responsible for performing rituals that maintained cosmic order. The Red Queen lived during what would later be seen as Palenque's Golden Age. The city had emerged from a period of crisis and warfare to become one of the most powerful and culturally productive centers in the Maya lowlands. This transformation was largely the work of one man, the king who would be buried in the neighboring pyramid, Kinich-Jenab Peko. Peko came to power in 615 AD, when he was only 12 years old. His accession was unusual because his claim to the throne came through his mother, Lady Sakkuk, who served as regent. Normally, Maya kingship passed through the male line, but Palenque's royal dynasty had been disrupted by warfare and political instability, forcing this adaptation. Peko would rule for 68 years, one of the longest reigns in Maya history, dying in 683 at the age of 80, an extraordinarily long life for the period. During his reign, he transformed Palenque, commissioning the construction of most of the major buildings that still stand, patronizing arts and learning, and establishing Palenque's dominance over surrounding territories. He also needed to legitimize his rule, given the unusual circumstances of his accession. Much of the elaborate historical and mythological narrative carved into Palenque's buildings and monuments served this purpose, connecting Peko's lineage to ancient dynasties and divine beings, establishing his right to rule despite the break in normal succession patterns. This is where the Red Queen enters the story. According to hieroglyphic texts at Palenque, Peko married a woman named Lady Tiziak Buaja, also known as Apohel, in 626, when he was 23 years old. She was not from Palenque originally but came from a place called Uxtecu, possibly modern Tortuguero. This marriage was clearly political, creating or strengthening an alliance between Palenque and another powerful lineage. 4 years after the tomb's discovery, archaeologists debated the Red Queen's identity. Three candidates seemed most likely. First, Lady Yolikanel, Pakal's grandmother, who had been an actual ruling queen of Palenque in her own right, leading the city during warfare and beginning its recovery. Second, Lady Sakkup, Pakal's mother, who had served as regent and through whom Pakal's claim to the throne passed. Third, Lady Tiziak Buaja, Pakal's wife and the mother of at least 3 of his children, including 2 who would later rule as kings. DNA analysis ruled out the first possibility. Testing of bone samples from Pakal's skeleton and from the Red Queen showed they were not closely related, which eliminated the possibility that she was his mother or grandmother, who would have shared more genetic material with him. Dental analysis provided another clue. The Red Queen's teeth showed that she was not originally from Palenque. The minerals incorporated into tooth enamel during childhood reflect the water and soil chemistry of where a person lived during those formative years. Her teeth indicated she had grown up elsewhere, matching the historical record that Tiziak Buaja came to Palenque from another city for her marriage. Skeletal analysis revealed other details. The Red Queen had suffered from osteoporosis, bone loss that in ancient populations was often associated with multiple pregnancies and childbirth. Historical records indicated that Tiziak Buaja had given birth to her last child when she was 38, quite late for Maya women, and the stress of multiple pregnancies could explain the observed bone density loss. Most compellingly, when forensic artists created a facial reconstruction based on the Red Queen's skull, the resulting face bore a striking resemblance to depictions of Tiziak Buaja in Palenque's art. Maya artists, particularly at Palenque, were known for creating relatively realistic portraits of actual individuals rather than idealized representations. When the reconstruction was compared to the carved portraits of known royal women, it matched the images identified as Tiziak Buaja. The evidence, while not absolutely conclusive in the way a written identification would be, strongly indicates that the Red Queen was indeed Lady Tiziak Buaja, Pakal's wife and queen of Palenque. Lady Tiziak Buaja was born in the early decades of the 7th century, probably around 610 to 615. She arrived in Palenque in 626 for her marriage to Pakal, who was already king. She would have been around 16, perhaps slightly younger, which was a typical age for elite Maya women to marry. The marriage was clearly important politically. By bringing a wife from another lineage, Pakal was creating alliances, building the network of relationships that allowed Palenque to expand its influence. Tiziak Buaja's arrival would have been an occasion of ceremony and ritual, with celebrations, gift exchanges, and performances of dances and rituals that acknowledged the new alliance. As queen, Tiziak Buaja held significant status and probably real political power, though reconstructing the exact nature of her role is challenging given the limited historical record. What we know comes from hieroglyphic texts and artistic depictions at Palenque, supplemented by our understanding of Maya culture more broadly. Maya royal women were not merely ornamental. They participated in religious rituals, particularly those involving bloodletting and communication with gods and ancestors. They owned property and managed economic resources. They sometimes served as regents for underage heirs, and in rare cases like Lady Yolikanel, they ruled in their own right. Tiziak Buaja and Pakal had at least 3 children together. Their sons Kinich Balem, born in 635, and Kinich Joy Chitam, born in 644, would both eventually rule Palenque after their father's death. The succession of these sons, particularly given that they were sons of Tiziak Buaja specifically, reinforced their legitimacy and maintained the dynastic continuity that Pakal had worked so hard to establish. She appears in various carved panels and tablets at Palenque, depicted in ways that emphasize her status and her connection to divine power. In one particularly significant panel, the tablet of Temple 14, she is shown after her death, portrayed as embodying the moon goddess. Her son Kimbalame performs a ritual dance before her, and she offers him a representation of the god Kuil, an act that legitimizes his rule even after her death. This posthumous depiction reveals something crucial about her role. She was not just Pekel's wife and the mother of kings. She was understood to be a sacred figure in her own right, someone whose connection to divine forces continued after death, someone whose approval and support was necessary for royal legitimacy. Lady Tiziekbuajaw died on November 16, 672, at the age of between 55 and 60. In my understanding, death was not an ending but a transition, the beginning of a soul's journey to its place in the cosmos. For rulers and other elite individuals, this transition required elaborate preparation and ritual to ensure the soul reached its proper destination and maintained its connection to the living world. Her body would have been prepared according to complex mortuary rituals that had to be performed between 2 and 10 days after death. The body was placed in a limestone sarcophagus that had been carved for this purpose. The interior walls of the sarcophagus were painted with crimson cinnabar, that sacred red pigment made from mercury sulfide. Cinnabar was extraordinarily important in Maya cosmology and ritual. Its brilliant red color was associated with blood, with life force, with the east where the sun rose, and with rebirth and transformation. Covering a body with cinnabar was believed to help preserve it, to maintain the life force within it even in death, and to facilitate the soul's journey and eventual return. Her body was completely covered in cinnabar, so much that when archaeologists opened the tomb over 13 centuries later, everything inside was still brilliantly, vividly red. Her bones, the offerings placed with her, even the air inside the sealed chamber, everything carried that distinctive crimson stain. She was dressed in her finest garments and adorned with jewelry that proclaimed her status. A death mask made of malachite tesserae covered her face, with eyes of obsidian and limestone that seemed to gaze from beyond death. Malachite, a green stone, was precious to the Maya, associated with water, with maize, with life and fertility. The contrast of the green mask against the red cinnabar created a powerful visual and symbolic statement. Her head wore an elaborate diadem, a kind of crown ornament called a huyunal, which was characteristic of Maya ruling elites. This was made of jade, which the Maya valued above all other materials. Jade's green color connected it to precious water, to growing maize, to life itself. Owning jade required access to trade networks extending hundreds of miles, because jade sources were limited and carefully controlled. The amount of jade in her burial proclaimed Palenque's wealth and her personal status. Around her neck, her wrists, and her headdress, there were hundreds of beads, shell ornaments, and jade pieces. These weren't just decoration but had ritual and cosmological significance. The placement of ornaments on the body, the specific types of stone used, the colors and materials, all carried meaning in the complex symbolic language of Maya religion. 2 other people were buried with her, probably sacrificed at the time of her death to serve her in the afterlife. Human sacrifice was a real and important part of Maya religious practice, though its scale and nature have often been misunderstood. These sacrificial victims might have been servants, or captives, or others whose death was understood as necessary to properly honor her and ensure her successful transition. The location of her burial was profoundly significant. Temple 13 was built directly adjacent to the Temple of the Inscriptions, where Pekel himself would be buried 11 years after his wife's death. The 2 pyramids stand side by side, their bases almost touching, their tombs separated by just a few meters of stone and earth. This proximity was not accidental. Pekel likely commissioned or at least approved the construction of Temple 13 specifically as his wife's mortuary monument. The care taken in her burial, the wealth of the offerings, the elaborate ritual preparation, and especially the location right next to where Pekel himself would be interred, all speak to her importance to him and to Palenque's dynasty. In Maya cosmology, the pyramid itself was understood as a sacred mountain, a connection between the earthly realm and the divine. The tomb chamber deep within the pyramid was like a cave, a place where the boundary between worlds was thin, where the dead could maintain connection with the living. Building these two pyramids together created a sacred precinct, a place where Pakal and Tiziak Buaja could rest together even in death, where their descendants could come to communicate with them and seek their blessing and guidance. The physical arrangement also made a political statement. Anyone approaching the great plaza of Palenque would see these two pyramids together, a visual proclamation of the royal couple's enduring power and the dynasty they had established. Their sons, ruling after them, could point to these monuments as proof of their legitimacy, as physical embodiments of their parents' sacred status. The Red Queen's burial has fundamentally changed how scholars understand women's roles in Maya society. When Pakal's tomb was discovered in 1952, it was assumed to be exceptional, the burial of an unusually powerful king. But the discovery of an equally elaborate female burial right next door demonstrated that high-status Maya women could wield enormous power and receive the same kind of royal treatment in death. This has prompted re-evaluation of other evidence. Scholars now recognize that many Maya sites have evidence of powerful women, in hieroglyphic texts describing their actions, in artistic depictions showing them performing rituals, in burials containing rich offerings. Women like Lady Yolikanel, who ruled Palenque directly, or Lady Six Sky of Naranjo, who governed as regent and led in warfare, were not anomalies but part of a pattern. Maya women of the elite class participated in political decision-making, religious rituals, economic management, and sometimes military leadership. They could own property, commission art and architecture, and serve as patrons of culture. They were educated, literate, and engaged with the intellectual and artistic achievements of their civilization. This doesn't mean Maya society was egalitarian or that gender didn't matter. It clearly did. Men held most positions of overt political power, led most military campaigns, and were depicted more frequently in public art. But within the constraints of a patriarchal system, elite women carved out significant spheres of influence and exercised real power. For non-elite women, life was undoubtedly harder and more constrained. They worked in agriculture, textile production, and food preparation. They bore and raised children under difficult conditions. They had few opportunities for education or advancement. The power wielded by women like Tiziak Buaja was not available to the vast majority of Maya women, just as the power of male rulers was not available to most Maya men. But the Red Queen's tomb demonstrates that at the highest levels of Maya society, women could be accorded respect, honor, and recognition equal to that of men. Her burial was fit for a king because she had been, effectively, a queen in every meaningful sense. Lady Tiziak Buaja died in 672, but her story didn't end there. Her sons would rule Palenque after their father's death in 683, continuing the dynasty she had helped establish. Kinich Kenbalem, who became king at 48 years old, commissioned many of the greatest artistic achievements at Palenque, including the Temple of the Cross group with its elaborate iconography and historical texts. In some of these later monuments, Tiziak Buaja appears posthumously, depicted as a divine or ancestral figure whose blessing and approval legitimized her descendants' rule. She had become part of Palenque's sacred history, a link between the human and divine realms, an ancestor to be honored and called upon. Her tomb remained sealed and hidden for over 1,300 years, through the collapse of Maya classic civilization, through the Spanish conquest, through centuries when Palenque lay abandoned and overgrown by jungle. Local people knew of the ruins, of course, and European explorers began visiting and documenting Palenque in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Temple 13 kept its secret until 1994. The discovery of her tomb was one of the great archaeological findings of the late 20th century. The cinnabar preserved her bones remarkably well, allowing for DNA analysis, isotope studies, and detailed examination that revealed intimate details of her life and health. The burial offerings provided insights into Maya trade networks, religious practices, and artistic achievement. And the tomb itself, with its placement and elaborate construction, revealed the importance of royal women in ways that previous discoveries had only hinted at. but mysteries remain. We don't know much about her personality, her daily life, her relationships beyond the formal political connections. We don't know what she thought, what she feared, what brought her joy. The hieroglyphic texts tell us about her public role but reveal little of her private self. The artistic depictions show her in ritual contexts but don't capture her individual humanity. This is the nature of ancient history. We have fragments, pieces of evidence that we assemble into narratives, always aware that much remains unknowable. Lady Tiziak lived, loved, bore children, participated in rituals and politics, grew old and died. She was buried with honor and remembered as a sacred figure by her descendants. And now, centuries later, we can stand at her tomb and marvel at the civilization that created it, at the woman who was honored with such a burial, at the connection across vast stretches of time. Now we'll move forward through time again, away from the Maya world and into the 20th century to Mexico City and beyond. Here we meet another extraordinary woman, an artist whose work has become iconic, whose face is recognized worldwide, whose life story combines tragedy, passion, politics, and creativity in ways that continue to fascinate and inspire. Magdalena Carmen Frida Kahlo y Calderon was born on July 6, 1907, though she would later claim to have been born in 1910, the year the Mexican Revolution began, symbolically linking her identity to Mexico's struggle for transformation. She was born in Coyoacan, a village on the outskirts of Mexico City that has since been absorbed into the sprawling capital but maintains its distinctive character. Her father, Guillermo Kahlo, had immigrated to Mexico from Germany in 1891. He was a photographer skilled at his craft, making a living creating portraits and documenting architecture. He had come to Mexico after epilepsy, caused by an accident, ended his university studies in Germany. Her mother, Matilda Calderon y Gonzalez, was Mexican, of mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage, embodying the mestiza identity that would become central to Mexican nationalism. Frida was the third of four daughters in a household that valued education and artistic expression but struggled financially. The Kahlo family lived in La Casa Azul, the Blue House, a substantial home in Coyoacan that Guillermo had built. The house, painted its distinctive cobalt blue, was surrounded by gardens and would remain Frida's primary home throughout her life, the place she would return to again and again. When she was 6 years old, Frida contracted polio, that devastating disease that killed or crippled so many children before vaccines were developed in the 1950s. She survived, but the disease left her right leg thinner and shorter than her left, giving her a pronounced limp. This was the first of many physical challenges that would define her life. The illness confined her to bed for months. Other children teased her cruelly about her thin leg, calling her peg leg and other hurtful names. She became more isolated, spending time with her father rather than with peers. Guillermo, recognizing his daughter's resilience and intelligence, encouraged her interest in art and began teaching her photography. He was a significant influence, sharing with her his love of Mexican history and culture, his appreciation for indigenous Mexican art, his belief in education and self-improvement. As she recovered, Frida showed remarkable determination. She began playing sports despite her disability, taking up soccer, swimming, and even wrestling, all highly unusual for girls at that time. She wore long skirts to hide her affected leg and developed a fierce independence, refusing to be defined or limited by her physical condition. In 1922, when she was 15, Frida was accepted into the National Preparatory School in Mexico City, one of Mexico's most prestigious educational institutions. She was one of only 35 girls among 2,000 students, pioneering in an almost entirely male environment. She planned to study medicine, continuing her father's encouragement of her intellectual ambitions. At the preparatory school, she became part of a group called the Cachuches, named after the peaked caps they wore. These were politically engaged students, leftist in orientation, interested in Mexican nationalism and social reform. They read voraciously, debated politics and philosophy, and saw themselves as part of Mexico's post-revolutionary transformation. It was here that she first met Diego Rivera, the famous muralist who was 20 years older than Frida and was working on a mural at the school. She was fascinated by him, bold enough to tease him and his model mistress, declaring loudly that she would someday have his baby. Rivera found her amusing but didn't take her seriously. This encounter would have consequences neither of them anticipated. On September 17, 1925, 18-year-old Frida left her classes and boarded a bus with her boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Arias, heading home to Coyoacán. It was an ordinary day, an ordinary bus ride. They sat on a wooden bench toward the back, probably talking about their studies, their friends, their plans. The bus was crowded as buses always were, filled with working people returning home, students, vendors with their goods. The driver attempted to pass an oncoming electric streetcar at an intersection. Whether he misjudged the distance, whether the streetcar was going too fast, whether the wet pavement made control difficult, the result was catastrophic. The streetcar slammed into the side of the wooden bus, crushing it. The bus bent under the impact, then split open in the middle. Passengers in the center were thrown into the path of the moving streetcar. Those at the ends were compressed as the vehicle collapsed. People died instantly. Others were gravely injured, bleeding, screaming, trapped in the wreckage. Frida had been impaled by an iron handrail that tore loose from the bus in the collision. It entered through her left hip and exited through her pelvis and genitals. Gomez Arias, who had suffered only minor injuries, found her almost immediately. She was conscious, screaming in agony. He and others tried to help her, pulling out the handrail, which caused her even more excruciating pain. But the handrail injury was only part of the catastrophe her body had suffered. Her pelvis was fractured in 3 places. Her spine was broken in 3 places, with 3 additional vertebrae damaged. Her right leg was broken in 11 places. Her right foot was crushed and dislocated. Her collarbone was broken. Her shoulder was dislocated. 2 of her ribs were fractured. One witness later reported that someone on the bus had been carrying a packet of gold dust, perhaps a craftsperson or an artist. When the collision happened, this packet broke open, covering Frida's naked, bleeding body with gold dust, creating a horrifying, beautiful, surreal image that seemed to prefigure the art she would later create. The ambulance took her to the Red Cross Hospital in Mexico City. Doctors were doubtful she would survive the night. Her injuries were so extensive, so severe, that recovery seemed impossible. But Frida survived that first night and the next and the next. She underwent surgery to begin repairing the damage to her body. She was placed in a full-body plaster cast, immobilized, waiting for bones to knit and tissues to heal. After a month in the hospital, she was allowed to go home to La Casa Azul, but her ordeal was far from over. She would spend months bedridden, wearing a plaster cast that encased most of her body. The pain was constant and severe. She couldn't move, couldn't walk, couldn't do any of the things that had made her feel alive and independent. Her plans for medical school were destroyed. Her active, athletic lifestyle was gone. Her relationship with Gomez Arias, which had been passionate before the accident, would not survive the strain. At 18, confined to bed, in constant pain, facing an uncertain future, Frida could have given up. Many people in her situation would have. Instead, she began to paint. Her mother, Matilda, had a special easel made that allowed Frida to paint while lying in bed. Her father lent her his oil paints and brushes. Most importantly, a mirror was installed above her bed, angled so that Frida could see her own face, her own body, her own expressions. This mirror would be crucial to the development of her art. Unable to move, with few visitors because her friends were busy with their studies and lives, Frida had one constant subject readily available: herself. She began painting self-portraits, studying her own face with intense concentration, learning how to mix colors, how to apply paint, how to translate what she saw in the mirror onto canvas. Her first self-portrait, painted in 1926 while she was still recovering, shows a serious young woman in a velvet dress, her neck elongated, her expression solemn and direct. It's technically accomplished for someone with limited training, showing that Frida had genuine talent. But more importantly, it established a pattern that would define her work, using her own image to explore identity, pain, emotion, and experience. At first, she might have seen painting as simply something to do during the long, boring hours of convalescence. But gradually, she began to take it more seriously, to consider it not just as a pastime but as a possible career. She thought about becoming a medical illustrator, combining her interest in medicine and her developing artistic skills. But her body would not cooperate with plans for a normal career. The injuries from the accident left her with chronic pain that would plague her for the rest of her life. Her spine never healed properly, causing constant backaches and requiring her to wear supportive braces and corsets. Her right leg remained weak and painful. Her damaged pelvis would make pregnancy dangerous and probably prevent her from ever carrying a child to term, though she desperately wanted to be a mother. Over the next several years, as she slowly recovered enough mobility to leave her bed and move around with difficulty, Frida developed her artistic style. She was largely self-taught, learning through practice and observation rather than formal art education. She drew inspiration from Mexican folk art, from the retablos and ex-votos that ordinary people commissioned to give thanks for miracles or to ask for divine intervention. These small paintings on tin, with their naive style and direct emotional expression, influenced Frida's approach to composition and subject matter. She also absorbed influences from the European avant-garde, from surrealism particularly, though she would always insist that she didn't paint dreams but her own reality, her own lived experience. Her reality just happened to be filled with pain, isolation, and intense emotional and physical suffering that expressed itself in images that looked surreal but felt profoundly true. In 1928, Frida sought out Diego Rivera, the famous muralist she had encountered years earlier at the preparatory school. She was 21, he was 42, fat and frog-like as she would later describe him, but also brilliant, famous, charismatic, and deeply engaged with Mexican nationalism and leftist politics that aligned with Frida's own beliefs. She went to where he was working on a mural and called up to him on his scaffold, asking him to come down and look at her paintings. Rivera, intrigued by this bold young woman, climbed down, examined her work, and immediately recognized genuine talent. He encouraged her to continue painting, to develop her unique vision, and inevitably he fell in love with her. Their courtship was brief. Despite opposition from Frida's parents, who saw Rivera as too old, too fat, too politically radical, and too notorious for his many affairs, Frida and Diego married in August 1929. Her parents called it a marriage between an elephant and a dove. It was a partnership that would be passionate, creative, destructive, and enduring in turns. Both were artists of genuine talent and vision, though Rivera was far more famous and successful at the start. Both were committed to leftist politics, joining the Mexican Communist Party and advocating for social revolution. Both were deeply Mexican in their identity, celebrating indigenous culture and rejecting European pretensions. But it was also a deeply troubled relationship from the start. Rivera had a well-earned reputation as a womanizer, having affairs with his models, with other artists, with anyone who interested him. Frida, discovering his infidelities, began having her own affairs with both men and women. They were jealous of each other, fought constantly, separated and reunited multiple times. In 1930, they traveled to the United States, where Rivera had been commissioned to create murals in San Francisco, Detroit, and New York. Frida accompanied him, living in the United States for most of the next 4 years. She hated it. She found Americans cold, materialistic, and racist. She missed Mexico desperately, its colors, its warmth, its culture. But these years were crucial for her development as an artist. Exposure to American art, particularly to more modern and experimental styles, influenced her work. The emotional pain of being far from home, of being seen as just Diego Rivera's wife, rather than an artist in her own right, of suffering multiple miscarriages and medical crises, all fed into increasingly powerful and disturbing paintings. Frida's art is inseparable from her physical and emotional pain. She painted what she experienced, and what she experienced was often agony, loss, and fear. Her paintings are small, mostly self-portraits, intensely personal and often disturbing in their frank depiction of suffering. In Henry Ford Hospital, painted in 1932 after one of her miscarriages, Frida depicts herself naked on a hospital bed, blood pooling beneath her, tears on her face, floating in a barren landscape. Around her float symbolic objects connected by red ribbons like umbilical cords. A fetus, medical instruments, a snail representing the slowness of time during suffering, an orchid given to her by Rivera that seemed to mock her loss with its perfect beauty. This painting violated every convention of how women, especially Mexican women in the 1930s, were supposed to present themselves. It was raw, explicit about bodily functions, unashamed in its emotional vulnerability. It was also powerful, communicating the reality of miscarriage and grief in ways that resonated with other women who had experienced similar losses but were expected to suffer in silence. Over her career, Frida would have multiple miscarriages and at least one abortion, likely multiple. Her damaged pelvis and spine made carrying a pregnancy to term nearly impossible, and attempts to do so caused her excruciating pain and endangered her life. This inability to bear children was one of the great sorrows of her life, and she returned to the theme repeatedly in her art, painting babies, depicting herself with broken bodies, exploring the connection between creation, fertility, and feminine identity. Another powerful work from this period is My Birth, painted in 1932. It shows a woman giving birth to herself, or perhaps to a dead infant, the image ambiguous and disturbing. A portrait of the Virgin of Sorrows hangs on the wall above the bed, witnessing the scene but offering no comfort. The painting is shocking in its directness, refusing to prettify or sentimentalize childbirth, instead showing it as blood, pain, and potential death. These paintings were revolutionary not just in their subject matter but in their very existence. Art history had rarely acknowledged women's bodies as sites of suffering and struggle. Female nudes existed in abundance, but they were idealized, passive objects of the male gaze. Frida's paintings showed female bodies as they were experienced from within, painful, damaged, bleeding, aging, suffering. They were self-portraits in the deepest sense, images of how it felt to inhabit her particular body at her particular moment in time. Frida and Diego's commitment to leftist politics and the Mexican Communist Party was genuine and central to their identities. They saw art as inherently political, as a tool for social transformation. After Rivera was expelled from the Communist Party in 1929 over ideological disputes, Frida resigned in solidarity, though this must have been difficult for her as she was deeply committed to communist principles. During their time in the United States in the early 1930s, both artists became increasingly critical of American capitalism. Frida found the stark inequality shocking, the breadlines and poverty existing alongside enormous wealth. Her painting My Dress Hangs There, created in 1933, expresses her disillusionment with American society through a satirical landscape showing industrial pollution, religious hypocrisy, and consumer excess, with her traditional Tewana dress hanging empty above the chaos. In the mid-1930s, as Stalin's purges decimated the Soviet leadership and the international communist movement fractured, Diego and Frida shifted their sympathies toward Leon Trotsky, who had been exiled by Stalin and was facing constant threats of assassination from Soviet agents. When Diego convinced Mexican President Lázaro Cárdenas to grant Trotsky asylum, Frida greeted the Russian revolutionary and his wife Natalia Sedova at the port in January 1937, bringing them to stay at La Casa Azul. The arrival of Trotsky transformed the house into a fortress, with armed guards, barricaded windows, and constant security measures. Trotsky was under genuine threat, and everyone knew it. Living under such conditions would have been tense and difficult, but for Frida, It also represented being at the center of world historical events, hosting one of the most important revolutionary figures of the 20th century. Within months, Frida and Trotsky began an affair. She was 30, he was 57. Their relationship was conducted under the nose of Natalia and Diego, with Frida and Trotsky leaving each other notes hidden in books and stealing moments alone whenever possible. The affair lasted only a few months before Natalia discovered it and gave her husband an ultimatum. They broke it off, though they remained friendly. On Trotsky's birthday in November 1937, which was also the anniversary of the Russian Revolution, Frida gave him a self-portrait she had painted specifically for him. In it, she stands between parted curtains as if on a stage, dressed in traditional Mexican clothing, her expression confident and alluring. She holds a bouquet of flowers and a letter that reads, "To Leon Trotsky, with all my love, I dedicate this painting on the 7th of November 1937. Frida Kahlo in San Angel, Mexico." This painting demonstrates Frida's use of traditional Mexican retablo composition, the devotional paintings created to honor saints. By placing herself in this format and dedicating the painting to Trotsky, she was positioning him as a kind of secular saint, a revolutionary martyr, while also presenting herself as a beautiful and desirable woman worthy of his attention. It was both political statement and love letter, mixing her personal feelings with her ideological commitments. The Trotsky household eventually moved out of La Casa Azul to a nearby residence, and Diego and Frida's relationship with them became strained over both personal and political differences. In May 1940, there was a failed assassination attempt on Trotsky by Mexican muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros, who remained loyal to Stalin and the Mexican Communist Party. Diego Rivera was briefly a suspect in the plot, though he had nothing to do with it. Then in August 1940, a Soviet agent named Ramon Mercader succeeded in killing Trotsky with an ice axe driven into his skull. Frida had met Mercader in Paris the previous year, and when the murder happened, she was brought in for questioning by Mexican police. She spent a day in custody before being released. The murder shook the international leftist community and demonstrated the reach of Stalin's vengeance. Despite these traumatic events, Frida remained committed to communist ideals for the rest of her life. She would eventually be readmitted to the Mexican Communist Party in the 1950s, and her later paintings often included explicit communist imagery. One of her final paintings, "Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick," created in 1954 when she was dying, shows her supported by the hands of Karl Marx while she discards her crutches, a vision of communism as both personal and societal salvation. 1939 was a crisis year for Frida personally. Her relationship with Diego, always tumultuous, fractured completely when she discovered that Diego had been having an affair with her younger sister Cristina. This betrayal was devastating, cutting deeper than Diego's other numerous infidelities because it involved someone from her own family, someone she trusted. Frida responded with rage and despair. She cut her long hair, which Diego loved, in an act of defiance and self-transformation. She created the painting "A Few Small Nips," based on a news story about a man who murdered his girlfriend and then told the judge he had only given her a few small nips with his knife. The painting shows a woman's body covered in stab wounds, blood everywhere, while a man stands over her holding a knife. It was a visceral expression of how Frida felt, murdered by betrayal, bleeding from wounds that no one else could see. During this same period, she painted "The Two Fridas," one of her largest and most iconic works. It shows two versions of herself sitting side by side, holding hands. The Frida on the left wears a Victorian-style white dress, European and formal. Her heart is exposed, cut open, and an artery leads from it to surgical forceps that are trying to stop the bleeding but failing. Blood drips onto her white dress. The Frida on the right wears traditional Tehuana clothing, her heart intact, and she holds a miniature portrait of Diego as a child, connected to her own heart by a visible artery. The painting explored the duality that Frida felt, the European educated woman and the Mexican nationalist, the person Diego loved and the person he rejected, the whole self and the bleeding, damaged self. The two Fridas are literally connected, sharing blood through their joined hands, suggesting that these aspects of identity cannot be separated. It was painted during her divorce from Diego, a literalization of feeling torn in two, divided between the person she was with him and the person she was without him. The divorce was finalized in November 1939, but it brought neither of them peace. They continued to see each other, to depend on each other emotionally. Within a year, they remarried in San Francisco in December 1940, though on different terms this time. Frida insisted on financial independence, maintaining her own home and income. They agreed to a non-sexual relationship, acknowledging that physical intimacy had become a source of pain rather than connection. They never lived together again in the conventional sense. Diego kept his studio in San Angel, while Frida lived primarily at La Casa Azul in Coyoacán. They maintained separate spaces but came together frequently, tied by bonds that went beyond conventional marriage. Shared politics, mutual respect as artists, genuine affection despite everything, and perhaps an inability to imagine life truly apart. The 1940s saw Frida's reputation as an artist begin to grow, though she would not achieve widespread international recognition until after her death. In 1938, she had her first solo exhibition in New York at the Julian Levy Gallery. The show was successful, with about half the paintings selling, and critics praised her unique vision. The surrealist poet André Breton, who had met Frida in Mexico, enthusiastically promoted her work, though Frida herself rejected the surrealist label, insisting she didn't paint dreams but her own reality. In 1939, she traveled to Paris for an exhibition that Breton had arranged. The trip was frustrating, with Breton proving disorganized and the show poorly managed. But Frida met other artists including Pablo Picasso and Marcel Duchamp, and the Louvre purchased one of her paintings, The Frame, making her the first 20th-century Mexican artist to be acquired by that prestigious institution. Back in Mexico during the 1940s, Frida was increasingly recognized as a significant artist in her own right, not merely as Diego Rivera's wife. She received commissions. She was invited to teach at the Ministry of Public Education School of Painting and Sculpture, and her work was included in important exhibitions. But all of this success was overshadowed by her deteriorating physical condition. The chronic pain that had begun with the bus accident when she was 18 intensified as she aged. Her spine, never properly healed, caused constant agony. She underwent multiple surgeries, trying to stabilize her back, to relieve pressure on nerves, to correct problems that seemed to multiply rather than resolve. Each surgery required months of recovery, during which she was confined to bed, wearing plaster casts or metal braces, unable to paint or move. She became dependent on painkillers and alcohol to manage the suffering. This dependency created new problems, affecting her memory, her ability to concentrate, her emotional stability. Her later paintings sometimes show the effects of this, with less precise brushwork, images that are more emotional than controlled. But they remain powerful, perhaps even more so for their raw expression of someone fighting to continue creating art even as their body failed them. In 1950, she underwent a major spinal surgery that left her in worse condition than before. She developed gangrene in her right foot, the leg that had been damaged by childhood polio. In 1953, the leg was amputated below the knee, a devastating loss for someone who had fought so hard to overcome physical disability. She was fitted with a prosthetic leg and tried to adapt, but the amputation plunged her into deep depression. Her diary from this period is heartbreaking, filled with expressions of pain, despair, and determination to continue. She wrote, "Feet, what do I need them for if I have wings to fly?" Attempting to find some defined hope even in the face of such loss. She decorated her prosthetic leg with embroidery and red leather, refusing to hide it, making it another form of self-expression and resistance. Despite her declining health, Frida remained politically engaged until the very end. In July 1954, just days before her death, She participated in a demonstration protesting the United States' role in overthrowing the democratically elected leftist government of Guatemala. It was raining and she was feverish, barely able to stand, but she insisted on attending, carried in her wheelchair, wrapped in blankets, her face set with determination. This demonstration was characteristic of who Frida was at her core, a committed revolutionary who believed that art and politics were inseparable, that personal suffering connected to collective struggle, that an individual had a responsibility to fight for justice even when that fight cost them personally. She never separated her artistic identity from her political commitments, seeing both as expressions of her vision for a more just and beautiful world. Her last painting, or one of her last, was Viva la Vida, watermelons arranged in a still life, the title written in red across the bright flesh of the fruit. It was a celebration of life, of color, of the simple pleasure of existence, created by someone who knew death was coming soon. The watermelons are vibrant, almost violently alive, asserting joy in the face of pain and approaching darkness. On the night of July 12, 1954, Frida developed a high fever and was in extreme pain. Her nurse noted that she had taken an overdose of painkillers, far more than had been prescribed. Whether this was accidental or a deliberate act of suicide has been debated ever since. Frida had talked about suicide before, had expressed exhaustion with the endless pain and suffering. Her diary entry from shortly before her death read, "I joyfully await the exit, and I hope never to return." She was found dead in her bed on the morning of July 13, 1954. She was 47 years old. The official cause of death was listed as pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in her lungs, though no autopsy was performed. Given the overdose and her expressed wishes to die, many historians believe she took her own life, finally ending the pain that had defined so much of her existence. Her body was taken to the Palace of Fine Arts in Mexico City, where it lay in state. Controversially, her coffin was draped with a flag bearing the hammer and sickle, the symbol of the Communist Party. This was controversial because Mexico at the time was dealing with Cold War pressures and anti-communist sentiment, but it was what Frida would have wanted. She had lived as a communist and she would be mourned as one. Diego Rivera was devastated by her death. He had been with her just days before, and despite all the complications of their relationship, he genuinely loved her. He would live another 3 years, dying in November 1957. When he died, his will specified that he wanted his ashes mixed with Frida's and scattered in the gardens of La Casa Azul. However, this wish was not honored, and they remained buried separately. Frida Kahlo died in obscurity by contemporary standards. She was known in Mexico and in certain artistic circles internationally, but she was not famous in the way we understand that term today. 4 decades after her death, she remained primarily known, when she was known at all, as Diego Rivera's wife rather than as a significant artist in her own right. This began to change in the 1970s and 80s, when feminist art historians and critics rediscovered her work and recognized its importance. They saw in Frida's paintings a woman artist who had centered female experience, who had painted the body from within, who had refused to make her art palatable or pretty. Her frank depictions of pain, sexuality, miscarriage, and identity resonated with second-wave feminism's emphasis on the personal as political. A major retrospective of her work in 1978, the first significant exhibition since her death, began the process of rehabilitation. Through the 80s and 90s, more exhibitions followed, more scholarship was published, and Frida's reputation grew. The 2002 film Frida, starring Salma Hayek, brought her story to mainstream audiences worldwide. Today, Frida Kahlo is one of the most recognizable artists in history. Her face, with its distinctive unibrow and flowers in her hair, appears on everything from tote bags to t-shirts to coffee mugs. She has become a symbol of female empowerment, of LGBTQ pride, of disability rights, of Mexican national identity, of artistic genius overcoming personal suffering. But this popularization has sometimes come at the cost of understanding the complexity and depth of her actual work and beliefs. Commercial products featuring her image often strip away the political content of her art, the communist commitment that she maintained throughout her life, the radical critique of capitalism and imperialism that was central to her worldview. She is made safe, made cute, made into a marketable icon rather than a revolutionary artist. The paintings themselves resist this simplification. When you stand before them in museums, they remain powerful, disturbing, beautiful, strange. They show a woman who refused to look away from pain, who insisted on depicting her reality no matter how uncomfortable that reality made viewers. They show someone who believed deeply in the possibility of revolution, both artistic and political, who saw beauty and terror as inseparable, who lived with passion and intensity even when that intensity caused suffering. Frida's impact on art history is profound. She helped establish a model of the artist as someone who could make their own life and body the subject of serious art. She demonstrated that women's experiences, particularly experiences that society preferred to keep hidden like menstruation, miscarriage, and chronic illness, were worthy subjects for art. She showed how personal identity could be constructed and performed through clothing, through self-portraiture, through deliberate artistic choices. For Mexican art and culture specifically, Frida remains a towering figure. She helped establish Mexican modernism as a force in international art. She demonstrated how pre-Columbian and folk art traditions could be incorporated into contemporary work without merely copying or appropriating. She embodied the post-revolutionary Mexican identity that valued indigenous heritage and rejected European dominance. For people living with chronic pain and disability, Frida offers a complex legacy. On one hand, her life demonstrates that disability doesn't preclude artistic achievement, that people can create meaningful work despite enormous physical challenges. On the other hand, her suffering was real and terrible, and her story is not one of simple triumph over adversity. She endured, she created, but she also suffered enormously, and that suffering should not be romanticized or minimized. Frida Kahlo's life spanned 47 years, from 1907 to 1954. In that time, she experienced devastating physical trauma, created approximately 200 paintings, participated in revolutionary political movements, loved passionately and suffered greatly, and established herself as one of the 20th century's most important artists. She was complicated, contradictory, brilliant, difficult, brave, and ultimately irreducible to any single interpretation or understanding. When we look at her self-portraits now, we see her looking back at us, her gaze direct and challenging, her expression difficult to read. She is showing us herself, but also asking us what we see, whether we can handle the truth of her experience, whether we're willing to look at pain and beauty intertwined. And in those moments of connection across decades, when her painted eyes meet ours, we understand something of what art can do. Make the past present, make the personal universal, make one woman's suffering and joy speak to everyone who will listen. And now, as these stories of medieval life and remarkable women fade into the peaceful darkness of your room, let yourself drift deeper into rest. You've traveled through centuries tonight, walked through a peasant's cottage at dawn, stood beside empresses and artists and queens. You felt the weight of history, the struggles and triumphs of people separated from us by vast stretches of time but connected to us through their shared humanity. The medieval peasant woman, rising in the cold darkness, working until exhaustion, surviving despite everything. Catherine, transforming herself from Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst into Empress of Russia, wielding power with intelligence and determination. The Red Queen, honored with cinnabar and jade, remembered as sacred by her descendants. Frida, painting her pain and passion onto canvas, refusing to be silent, creating beauty from suffering. These were real people living real lives, facing real challenges. They endured. They created. They changed the world in ways large and small. And now their stories have traveled through time to reach you here, in this moment as you settle into sleep. Your breathing is slow and steady now. Your body is heavy, relaxed, sinking deeper into the comfort of your bed. The images from these stories might float through your mind as you drift toward dreams, mixing with your own thoughts, your own experiences, creating new patterns and connections. There's no need to hold on to any of it. Let the words and images wash over you and through you. Let yourself float in that peaceful space between waking and sleeping, where everything feels distant and quiet and safe. Tomorrow will come with its own concerns and tasks, but right now there is only this: warmth, darkness, comfort, rest. If you're still listening to these words, know that it's perfectly fine. There's no pressure to sleep right this moment. These stories are here for you, accompanying you through the night, giving your mind something gentle to focus on while your body rests. And when sleep comes, it will come naturally, gently, like a tide slowly rising. Before we end, just a small request. If you've enjoyed this journey through history tonight, if these stories have helped you relax or given you something interesting to think about as you drift off, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us create more of these sleep stories, more journeys through history, more opportunities to connect with the past while we rest in the present. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May your sleep be deep and peaceful. May you wake refreshed and ready for whatever tomorrow brings. And may the stories of those who came before us remind you that we are all part of something larger, a great human story that continues to unfold across the centuries. Good night.